eventually. And in this last section now, we will get to 2 talks by our PhD students. I'm very happy that we actually have someone now moving from the pure neuroscientific or psychological aspects to some more understandable aspects in philosophy. And as such, I'm very happy to welcome today Jason K. Day, who is originally from South Africa, a philosopher, currently doing his PhD in Fribourg, where he is also quite engaged on different boards, including the aesthetics and critique committee, also, needless to say, or not surprisingly, the local student organization there, which, as we learned today, is Proof. And also, very interestingly, he is the area editor of a very particular section of a journal on philosophy of anarchism, which seems to be, as far as we can tell here, and I was told, is one of his special topics besides Buddhist philosophy. So let's see where this mixture of Buddhist philosophy and anarchism might lead to when it comes to psychedelics, and let's please welcome Jason K. Day.
Okay, all right, there I am. Great, well, thanks everyone for listening to whatever's going to happen next. Okay, right, today what I want to present to you is my PhD project, which is currently in progress. So around about halfway, we're going to get from what I've actually written into what I'm planning to write. So I hope that makes sense as we get there. And the title of my PhD project is Psychedelic Attention on the Phenomenology of Psychedelic Experiences. Another possible title is Tripping Balls, What's Going On? Let's see. Okay, so just to get to the basics, right, so we're all on the same page. When I speak about psychedelic experiences in the most basic sense, I mean any kind of experience that is induced by the intake of LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, or DMT, as DMT contained in changa, freebase, or ayahuasca. Okay. Now, that's the most basic definition, but what I want to be concerned with here is the nature of their experiences that people report and describe. So, what I have noticed as I've poured through trip reports, and I'll explain how I've been doing that later, is that what is, in a general sense, very widely reported by people concerning their psychedelic experiences is that when they take a psychedelic, they have unusual to radical structural changes to their experience. This can be things like the things in which, the way in which their perception is structured dramatically changes, the way in which they experience themselves dramatically changes. We have, like, for instance, the term ego-dissolution. There might be drastically different experiences of time and space. These are all very general ways in which the structure of usual experience that has basic features like self-awareness, awareness of time and space, all these things are widely reported as changing. Yeah, so for a first little definition here, structural changes, I mean changes to the presence, composition, and relation of features of experience. And by features of experience, I mean whatever appears in your experience. Me talking right now, perhaps the pressure of the seat beneath you, anything that appears in your experience. Okay, the next thing that I noticed as I was studying trip reports is that psychedelic experiences are widely and emphatically described in terms of attention and associated vocabulary, or what I might call an attentional language. And this is things like when people say that they felt like they had a far, greatly wider degree of attention during a psychedelic experience, that they could experience and focus on far more at once than they ever could. So they might say, like, the foreground and the background fell away, everything was equally present. They might say that the things that is usually present in their experience is present with so much more, and here's the attentional language again, vividness, saliency, clarity, and so forth. People also say everything which they usually don't notice suddenly is radically foregrounded. People also describe being deeply concentrated on, immersed in, or absorbed in experiencing very small or mundane details in the world, like the patterns on the floorboard and so forth. So these are ways in which people use attentional language that I've noticed is very common. Now, those are the basics to get started. Now to the basic questions. This is a very basic question. Do people have similar experiences when they take psychedelics? This is a question that has not been studied. It hasn't. So I started from this general point. I want to figure out that. We all talk about psychedelic experiences. Someone might even talk about the psychedelic experience. But are we all talking about the same thing? Are we describing the same thing? Can we speak about psychedelic experiences in general, or the psychedelic experience? Is there something that it is to have a psychedelic experience? And are people who are reporting experiences after taking psychedelics having similar kinds of experiences? And to ask whether there's such a thing as psychedelic experience or similar experiences between people is to ask a question about the structure of the experience. Does it have common features and common ways in which those features are related? Right. So, in my PhD project, I start off from a first and a second thesis. The first one is concerning the nature of attention. Because, so I've noticed all this attentional language in trip reports, but then I'm not quite sure what I'm looking at. What is attention? And it turns out that that is a very debatable philosophical topic. So this is my basic idea on the nature of attention. I think that attentional language describes the structure of experience and how it transforms. That's when we might say that something's the center of our attention, or we're becoming distracted. This is all or something's vivid or vague, ambiguous, faint in the background, foreground. This is all ways in which we describe what's present in our experience, but not only that, how everything that's present at once is not present in the same way. Some things are more prominent, and that's constantly dynamic and changing. This is why I think we've developed attentional language to describe the structure of our experience and how it changes and communicated with each other. Now, the second point in this thesis, and this is a very controversial point, is the nature of attention and its associated vocabulary is how people use the concept as part of their attentional language for describing the structure of the experience and how it transforms. What that means, this is the controversial part, is it's very common across philosophy, cognitive science, and psychology to think of attention as some kind of activity, and an activity that specifically structures experience by selecting some content and making it more prominent while other content is backgrounded. I don't think there's any such thing as attention in that sense. I think what attention is only a way in which we describe our experience. Now, if you would like in the discussion, I could get into why I think that exactly. But it has something to do with the fact that if you think attention is an activity that structures experience, it's because you think there's such a thing as sensory data or information in a world, but it just being in a world doesn't have any structure. There's no foreground or background to the sensory data or information. That's only a feature of subjective experience. So then you need a solution. Well, how then is that sensory data and information structured? Then people come up with the idea there's something, an activity, attention, that makes it be the case. But from a phenomenological perspective, which means we only take the evidence of direct experience as your starting point, there is no reason to believe that there's any such thing as unstructured sensory data or information that's independent of your experience. Our experience just always is already structured, but we can describe how it's structured and how it changes, and that's what attentional language does. Right, I hope that makes sense. Now, the second is and this concerns psychedelic experiences, is what I call the phenomenological thesis. First, that psychedelic experiences are prominently described by people in terms of attention. And then second, I think that by studying the most common attentional descriptions used by people to describe the most commonly reported structural changes to the experience, we can answer the question of whether people have similar experiences when they take psychedelics. we see a way in which people very commonly describe their experience, and we see how they use that to describe very common structural changes. For instance, one example, we'll get to this in a bit, but one example to get us started is it's not the case that anyone just has ego-dissolution. It's very common that people have ego-dissolution as a process of becoming deeply concentrated or focused on a very specific thing to such an intense degree that they are no longer aware of usually basic features of their experience like time, space, and themselves. Okay. Right, now, I will get to what we're all here for, which is the tripping. But in order to understand what that is, I'm going to give you some very exciting philosophical definitions that are going to help us to understand that. Consider this, like in a trip, the come-up of my talk. We're going to get there. Okay, it's just starting to set in now. All right, so I've already mentioned what I think attention is. It's just how we use the concept to describe the structure of experience and how it changes. The structure of experience, by this I mean the presence and relation of phenomena in terms of prominence and relevancy. I'll mention more about that in a bit. That's just to say, we're never just aware or conscious of one thing at any given time. We're conscious of many things, and not to the same degree. There are relations between them. Okay? What do I mean by phenomena? Phenomena is whatever appears in your experience, just as it appears, but anything like, so exciting to use a chair, classic philosophical example. But you know, when you look at chairs when you're tripping, it's exciting. So the philosophical stereotype becomes more fun. Right, so like a chair, a phenomenon is anything that appears in your experience, just like that. But anything that appears in your experience is not just a homogeneous thing. There's not just a chair in general. The chair itself has many features, like its shape, its color, the wood grain, the tactile sense of like maybe the temperature of the steel, its distance to you, all these things. So any phenomenon itself has a structure of features, and some of those will be more prominent and less prominent. Like if you're just wanting to sit on a chair, you're not going to notice the different grains and patterns. What's going to be most prominent is something like its shape and its curvature. Okay, last fun definition, attentional transformations. That's just what that means, is structural changes in experience described in terms of attention. Okay, so there we go. Now, the last point to be made here, before we get into the good stuff, is I drew a lot of inspiration because, as I mentioned, the basic question of do people have similar experiences when they have psychedelics has not been addressed, and has not been addressed in phenomenology. But I drew a lot of influence from a phenomenologist called Aaron Gervich and his idea of attention and how experience is structured. And I think it's very helpful to understand the way the structure of experience changes when you take psychedelics. And his basic idea is that experience is most generally structured into 3 dimensions. The theme is what is most prominent in your experience. You might call it the focus of attention or the center of attention. The context is whatever is less or secondarily prominent in experience, and is so because it's relevant to whatever your theme is. The margin is whatever is least prominent in experience because it is irrelevant to the theme. So, for an example, if I hope it's going well so far, hopefully my presentation is the theme of your experience, if you're not bored. And the context might be all the memories or thoughts you have about psychedelic experiences. You're experiencing that now, and it's in the context because it's relevant to what I'm talking about. And the margin is everything that is present in your experience, but that is irrelevant to the theme. Keeping with the chair example, but as soon as I say it, it's not going to be true anymore. The pressure of the chair against your body, for instance, and the hum of cars outside. Okay. So, now, my phenomenological method, don't worry about the words there, I'll describe them in a second. So what it is that I'm doing is conducting a phenomenological study of qualitative self-reports, or trip reports. Now, I would say my method of, first of all, collecting these trip reports is, I would say in a word, anarchic. That doesn't mean chaotic. It means that I have no concern for who it was that reported it, and I have no concern for what context the person reported it in. Clinical setting, out in a forest, looking at art, and it could be Aldous Huxley or some anonymous person on Erowid. I treat all of these reports as equally interesting because what I'm trying to do is gather as great a spectrum of reports across contexts, individuals, doses, substances, and I'm trying to see what are the common features throughout all of these variations. Right, and so some of the texts I look at, and I'm precisely only looking at qualitative trip reports. I don't look at, although it's interesting to look, I'm not studying, for instance, data gathered by psychometric questionnaires or data concerning neural correlates. And that's for a specific reason. So when we're doing phenomenology, phenomenology is often used in some fields just to mean just taking into account subjective experience, but phenomenology in a philosophical sense is a very specific way of studying experience. And the first step of doing that is what's called taking up a phenomenological attitude or conducting the epiche. What this means for me is that when you want to study the nature of an experience, first of all, you want to try to, it's not wholly possible, but try to the best of your ability to bracket, is the word, or put aside all previous theories about the nature of experience. Those include, for instance, because they're all metaphysical ideas, that may have nothing to do with the experience. You'll only find that out if you actually study the experience. Ideas like, well, all experience is reducible to neural activity, or the opposite being the case. We bracket that. We just want to look at the experience. The second step is what's sometimes called the transcendental reduction. When I have my trip report, a trip report doesn't simply have everything that a person reports about the experience, but is often because people report after the case, is mixed up with interpretations of the experience rather than direct descriptions of what happened. So in the second step, I reduce the reports, again, insofar as possible, because they are mixed, just to the most direct descriptions of an experience. So if someone said, I saw the wall breathe, and it breathed in this way, then that's relevant. But if they say, and this is because this is what's happening in the default mode network, no, that's not what I'm looking at, right? So what I mean to say is that, just to stress this, all studies concerning neural activity, and to a second point, therapy, the purposes and possible uses of psychedelic experiences are, when it comes to phenomenology, secondary concerns. We first want to find out what the experience is, and then we'll actually be in a better position to understand how it's possible that these purposes can be in place, and we can even understand what people are saying in the first place. The last two have something called the eidetic reduction. This is about the common features. So now I have just the most direct experiences from all these trip reports, and then I go, okay, now I'm trying to find the most common features and common ways of speaking between all of these reports, and trying to connect the ways of speaking and the types of descriptions. And then the last part is a second order description. I take all these stories and, trying to be as faithful to all the individual stories, I tell a larger general story about what the most common features are of psychedelic experiences. And in many ways, I just consider myself to be doing a elaborate form of storytelling. I collect stories and then I tell a big story about it, right? Because I'm concerned with the ways in which people describe their experiences. This is very important, as I've mentioned, because if you want to know what's the use of psychedelic experience, how it's correlated to neural activity, and I think very importantly, what the political status of freedoms to use psychedelics should be, this can only start from a very sincere study of the nature of the experience. Okay, so now, this is, I say tentative because, as I mentioned, it's a work in progress. So far, I've identified 6 thematic categories for the most common attentional transformations described. And you can remember, as I said, when I say attentional transformation, I mean any structural change in experience that people so widely and emphatically use attentional language to describe. I'm going to go through these with lots of, I think, like good examples in terms of descriptions from reports. They are expansion, contraction, merging, fractal zoom, plasticization, and a real wacky one called unsense, but we'll get to that. A new philosophical term I'm workshopping for unsense is also as a hyphenated term, fundamental what the fuckness. But okay, let's move on. All right, so here are just some good examples of phrases with attention that you can find through, it's so common in people's trip reports. Something like supernormally clear focus of attention, very clear but rapidly changing focus of attention, extraordinary intensity of attention, attention superdivided, enormous sensitivity, hypersensitivity, immense concentration, heightened awareness, expansion of consciousness, and then also words like incredibly heightened clarity, vividness, saliency, detail, complexity. Right. So, let's get to the first one. So, I'm sure we've all heard psychedelic experiences characterized as an expansion of consciousness, right? Now, so this is, I think, one of the very common ways of describing the experience, and that is attentional. People are using attentional language here. Now, broadly speaking, before I get to the examples, when people, this attentional transformation of expansion that I call, is when people say that they experience not only more phenomena than usual to some way, either that everything that they usually don't notice, or at least underappreciate, or is in the margins, is suddenly on an equal footing with everything all at once, and then their consciousness feels expanded or widened. But it's also to say that specific phenomena appear with a far denser amount of complexity and detail. So that's generally what people are saying. So here are some good reports. Sensations were acute. I heard, saw, felt, smelled, and tasted more fully than ever before or since. What I experienced was essentially, with few exceptions, the usual contents of experience, but that of everything there was more. This more is what I think must be meant by expansion of consciousness. Awareness has many more levels, is many dimensioned. That was a LSD report. And then, each object that I looked at held my fascinated attention. I felt I had never really seen this garden before. I was enchanted with each plant, leaf, flower, tree trunk, and the earth itself. Each blade of grass stood separate and distinct, edged with light. Each was supremely important. LSD as well. I find a notable alteration in my ability to focus my eyes. I can focus on a wider range of depth than normal. As I write in my notebook, not only is the page in focus, but also the floor behind it, as well as the items in my peripheral. Foreground and background are strangely visible in full clarity and detail. Right, that's a report from Erowid. And what's interesting here is that in our usual experience, we're quite used to only really having one theme in our experience, one thing that is most prominent and everything else is more vague. But what people seem to be describing here when they say there's a wider scope of attention and expansion of consciousness is that there are, I would say, multiple themes simultaneously, and that can be to various degrees. And that's when someone says, can say things like, there was no foreground or background before, it's just bam, everything's there, kind of vibes. Kind of vibes is a very serious phrase. Okay, if you're interested in that part, I recently published and co-authored with my supervisor this article that you could check out called Psychedelic Expansion of Consciousness, where we try and understand that term in terms of attention, that phrase that's so very popular. Okay, moving on to contraction. In many ways, this is sort of the opposite of expansion. This is when people say that their whole experience contracted intensely to one very specific and often either something usually very mundane, that's usually in the margins, some highly specific thing, such as, like I mentioned, maybe the grains on the floorboard, or like a wisp of steam from a teacup, and then that is just almost all that there is. So here's some reports emphasizing that. Close observation of the bark was astounding, and here I was, leaning against the brick house, bound by concentration and the microscopic growth and flow of the particles. A dandelion I glanced at grew 2 feet high. Everything was magnified. As I strolled, my attention was wholly grasped by a small dewdrop on the grass. It was utterly captivating. And here's quite a famous and quite amusing one. Those folds in the trousers, what a labyrinth of endlessly significant complexity. And the texture of the gray flannel, how rich, how deeply, mysteriously sumptuous. So these are all examples of these tiny things, and often mundane things, like, the folds in a trouser that are suddenly present, almost swallowing up the whole experiential field, and present with deep complexity and detail that's usually not noticed at all. Right, and a point to be made here in ego-dissolution I mentioned also. I have noticed that, and there's a lot to be made sense here, there are many types of ego-dissolution. And this is not sufficiently distinguished in the literature. Like, for instance, ego-dissolution might be something like my usual sense of the self went away, and now there's a novel one or a much radically changed one. Or, in a different sense, I had no self-awareness. Those are quite different. But generally, I've noticed that, for instance, in the case of self-awareness dissipating or disappearing from experience, the self, you could say, disappearing from experience, it typically follows from these kinds of things. Another good example in Doors of Perception from Huxley is when he speaks about being completely absorbed in chair legs, just chair legs. It's like, whoa, chair legs. And then he says, like, the more he's so into looking at the chair legs, so immersed and concentrated on that, then there was no longer any such thing as him versus the chair or anything else. There was just, he says something like, there was just the not me and the not me that was the chair. There was just chair, just chairness. Oh yeah, radical chairness. Okay, now the next one is merging. This often also very much follows from contraction. Right, and that's the next, I got ahead of myself, but let's read the proper one. The legs, for example, of that chair, how miraculous their tubularity, how supernatural their polished smoothness. I spent several minutes, or was it several centuries, not merely gazing at those bamboo legs, but actually being them, or rather being myself in them, or still to be more accurate, for I was not involved in the case, nor in a certain sense were they, being my not self in the not self, which was the chair. Right? So then something like enraptures or captures your attention so much that you become part of that thing. And this is just a point here, is although most phenomena in our experience appear as distinct, like I usually don't experience myself at the chair, it's always the case that different phenomena are becoming parts of each other. So a good example is like, you might just look at the veins of a leaf, and then, to use a metaphor here, you zoom out, and now you're looking as the veins of the leaf as not, or the leaf as not one phenomenon, but as a feature of the tree, and then you zoom out more, and then you're not just looking at the tree as the phenomenon, but the tree as a feature of the whole forest, which is the larger phenomenon. Yeah, so this is how merging can happen as well. Right, here's another example. Slowly the music seemed to absorb all my consciousness. It seemed to me as though the music and I became one. You do not hear it, you are the music. It seems to play in you. It, LSD, seemed to induce an effortless, absorbed, and timeless power of inward-turned concentration. Right. Another way in which they might be merging is, when I mentioned earlier on expansion, there's a sense of yourself expanding to include or be included in everything you experienced at once. And your sense of self or awareness of yourself is no longer anything prominent, but is equal to all else. And everything you experience can sort of confusingly be experienced as a whole phenomenon rather than being made up of independent phenomena. And then there's this merging experience that happens. Okay, here's a fun one. What I've called fractal zoom. And I'll show you a video in a second that illustrates it quite nicely. I first had the thought in my mind, I don't know if you've ever seen those videos of fractal zoom on a Mandelbrot set, and I was like, yeah, it's kind of like that. And then I typed it in on YouTube, and the most popular video is called The Hardest Trip. And I was like, okay, so people think that. Yeah, cool. Okay, so here's some examples of that. And what I mean by fractal zoom is when you focus, there's contraction of attention, concentration, to a very small specific thing, but then that small specific thing starts expanding in so much complexity and detail in terms of its features that it starts becoming a whole experiential field. And then you can have the sense of that just endlessly happening. One thing becomes everything, which is a whole new experiential field, and people describe like falling endlessly like a fractal zoom into one thing. Okay, so here's some good examples. Ever more complex variations upon a theme, ferns sprouting ferns in multi-dimensional spaces, vast kaleidoscopic domes of stained glass or mosaic, or patterns like the models of highly intricate molecules, systems of colored balls, each of which turn out to be a multitude of smaller balls forever and ever. And I fell deeper and deeper into the visual experience. Visuals were more powerful I've ever known. It felt as if I was speeding through a tunnel of fractals, like zooming through a Mandelbrot set. And lastly, the mescaline hurricane from the very beginning, in fact, seemed to be concentrated on the same point on which my attention was concentrated. Right, and then to illustrate what I mean by the fractal zoom, if you could please play the video for me. Excuse the cringy music, but it's happening. So, what you see now is a concentration to a very specific point, but then that specific point starts expanding into a whole world. This is usually, it can be accompanied by cringy music, but it's not necessary to the occurrence. And every time you think you get to like a point that it can't go any further, it just keeps going on, right, into a whole new world each time. Yeah, but you get the point, so thanks. Okay, and I'll move on then. Okay, now, the next one is plasticization. Plasticization refers to an extraordinary, like a looseness or plastic structure of experience, whereas our usual experience is quite stable, things change, but not extremely. And when people talk about plasticization, it's when people are saying things like whatever they saw, often when it's in terms of things they see, breathing, swelling, swaying, flowing. That's what plasticization as a term covers. Now what's going on here, I think, in terms of attention, is, as I mentioned, every phenomenon has a structure of features. That means it has many features, and the different features have certain prominences and relations. There's a theme, a context, and margin to every phenomenon. And phenomena that are familiar to us usually have a very stable structure because of habit. At some point, you don't notice the background features anymore, just the most prominent ones. You see the thing very generally, but what happens in psychedelic experiences, it seems, is that you're constantly attending to different features as more or less prominent, more or less relevant, and that just goes on endlessly, and then you get this flowing, moving, also in terms of phenomena in relation to each other, and then everything can feel like it's one big flow or river, as people sometimes use the metaphor. Right, so here are two examples. My focus drifts from the stones themselves and recenters on the squirming, squiggling strings of mortar that usually go unnoticed between each piece of rock. The gray material seems to be a single entity wrapping itself around the more colorful stones. It shrinks itself narrow, then expands. None of the breathing, wiggling, or rearranging is fast or chaotic. The visuals are syrupy and slow. And I quite like this trip report was titled Sipping on the World's Syrup, which I quite like. I might have that as a chapter title. Okay, then another one. I won't read the whole one this long. Then I suddenly saw the color of the wall waxing and waning, ebbing and flowing. The extraordinary character of light and color is unbelievable. So third dimensionality to color and a constant change. And there would be a symphony of variations on what is ordinarily a plain brown wall. Right, and just skipping to the last bold part, how attention and color and other things all were mixed up in that they were all part of the whole pulsating ebb and flow. It took enormous effort to try and separate out things sufficiently to describe what was happening accurately. Now, that last point gets to my last category, where things can change, be so fluid and so unusually changing, such that everything is in constant flux. That's very radical, speed, rapidity, or changes into a completely unusual abstract experience, abstract in the sense that it's not captured or possibly related to any of our usual experiences. And I call this unsense. Not nonsense experiences, and I'll explain why. Unsense, because there's a process to that. Also, I would say the structure of every experience has a sense, so there aren't experiences that are nonsensical, and the experiences, like usual experience, that are the sensible ones. They're different kinds of senses. Right. So there are two categories to this that I just hinted at. The first is when people talk about what I sometimes call mush experience, where is that there's no longer, it appears, any stable structure to experience. Everything is equally present, but everything is merging with everything else and producing novel patterns and phenomena, and everything just like blur, blur. That's also a philosophical sound. Right. So yeah, and then it consists of so much radical change that on the one hand, it can't be described because the moment it's described, it's changed, and it's constantly changing into novel things that you don't have words for, and your language is contained in your capacity to speak in that whole thing. And it's also the case that everything is mushy. What I mean by that is, usually in our experience, in terms of attention, things are theme, context, margin. But now, everything is just all at once the same thing, and you can't pick things out to make the focus to describe very easily. So here's a good example by a very interesting book called Alice and the Mind of the Universe, where this guy, Christopher Bach, did somewhere near to 70 sessions of 600 microgram sessions, so interesting stuff. So this unsense most often happens at high doses, but it's not necessarily the case. Right, whole parts not only of my personal being, but of reality as I had known it, were falling away suddenly and dramatically, as when large glaciers suddenly break off and fall into the sea. Over and over again, parts of my life fell away. Then parts of life itself fell away. I was repeatedly losing all frames of reference, and had just enough coherence left to recognize this fact and surrender to it again and again. Plunging ever further into unknown territory, I don't know how to describe this territory beyond repeating the phrase falling away. Being dismembered not of limb but of reality, every part of my world being ripped asunder, tossed aside, plunging deeper and deeper into chaos. Sometimes people will be just like everything melted, for instance, and everything was one multi-dimensional soup. Okay, and then another good one. Endlessly broken up. Our attempts at composition admit only this one constant. Vary, it is very. Everything is very. I was in an infinity mechanism. Everything that appeared was caught in this mechanism, from the paltry to the important. Tension language there again. I had accepted infinite fragmentation, the teeming state composed of what is smallest, which divides and outruns everything. So that's the first sense of unsense. Everything is so novel and fluid, you couldn't possibly begin to describe it, and you can't make sense of it. There's nothing particular to make sense of. But then there's another category I found, which is when, in fact, you go through this stage of intense fluidity, but then at some point, a stable structure of experience emerges, but is so abstract in the sense of so completely unlike any of our usual experiences that it's unsensical, because you have no concepts or words to make sense of it. But it's stable, it's just so abstract. Right, before I get to that, here's one of possibly my favorite quotes pertaining to the first category from McKenna. You see, what the psychedelic is going to do is that it's going to destroy your whole world, your whole conception of your world. And for some people, that's tremendously liberating. They say, wonderful, at last I'm free of it. Other people say, my God, now I'm hopelessly mad. I have nothing left to cling to. I've really done it this time. That's almost an aesthetic judgment, whether you like watching your world shredded before your eyes and made into nonsense. If that makes you feel liberated and secure, then you can sign up for this carnival. Okay. And then now into the second category that I skipped. This is the abstract, when things are just too abstract to understand or describe. The thing about profound, from McKenna again, about profound experiences is that if they're too profound, you can't remember them. In other words, if it's too out of category, completely unlike usual experience, other than you've just been through something that completely threw all your switches, you can't really say much about it. And finally, how do you describe it? It would be a picturesque style, which I do not possess, made of surprises, of nonsense, of sudden flashes, of bounds and rebounds, an unstable style, tobogganing and prankish. So, why I'm harping on about this unsense category is because I think it is greatly or almost entirely occluded, left out of current scientific considerations of psychedelic experience. There's a strong drive, and it's the nature of scientific study, to identify distinct phenomena and set them into categories, right? And also in other modes of thinking about it, when you might have some mystical ways of thinking about it, there's a strong sense of harmony or higher truths or things like that. But a lot of people have experiences of unsense that doesn't fit that, and it's just misrepresented in the literature. So I think it's something to look into a lot more. Yeah. Right, now to close up, and good, I have time for questions, is I've spoken about these common features. So what I've just described are across the trip reports that I've studied, in terms of how people describe the structural changes in terms of attention, those are the most common features and structural changes of psychedelic experiences on a general level, and then you get to unsense, and then who can say what's common because there's no language to speak it, right? But now to get to the variations. It's of course the case that different substances and doses may entail variances in the psychedelic experience. For instance, the temporal rate and duration of attentional transformations of the course of the experience may be faster or slower. You can think of how, for instance, an LSD trip can actually contain many different structures of experience. Sometimes it might feel like little bubbles, like you feel stable and then, woo, it's happening again, and off you go. And then DMT is just like, bam, and there you go. And we have a language for this, of course, in the folk language. We speak of the onset, come up, breakthrough, peak, come down, and afterglow. I think this is ways in which people have described how their experience is structurally changing in a certain direction. But it doesn't necessarily need to be the case. That's just very common. And then, of course, specific of the features of the experience that undergo intentional transformations to greater or lesser degrees can be varied in terms of substances and doses. For instance, it's very much the case when DMT is taken that you're blasted into a world that doesn't include perceptual phenomena anymore. And what's prominent is just, I'm not sure if you can even think of it in terms of imaginary phenomena, but that's all that is the case, where sometimes, for instance, people who take LSD say they felt very childlike and they wanted to explore everything in the world around them. Right, and I think we can talk about a psychedelic style. I don't think you can say there is a structure of experience that all psychedelic experiences share. That's very static. I think there's a very similar way in which when you take a psychedelic, your experience changes. You can say there's a style that's composed of very common movements or changes that I've described, those few categories. Just in the same way as you can look at different pieces of art, or let's use a moving instance, you can look at different people dancing, and you can see common ways in which they move, and you can identify a general style. That's not to say that all of the dances are the same, but that they share a general style in terms of how the movement happens. I think the same is the case with psychedelic experiences, and I think that people describe that most commonly in terms of attention. So I think that's one way, efficient way of making sense of it, because if you want to just go, what happens, you're not going to get very far. So, right. Yeah, that's my story that I'm telling. And yeah, people have spoken a lot about their emotive motivations for doing their research. As I mentioned, the purpose of doing phenomenology is just to understand the nature of the experience and try to bracket out questions of how this could be used, for instance, in therapy, or who should be able to do it under what circumstances. But I see my project as fundamentally political after I've done that work. Why? Because we have very bad stories, or a lack of stories, about psychedelic experiences. People aren't talking about it. People aren't sharing language, developing shared languages, which means any political discussion about who should be able to take psychedelics is completely confused most of the time, because we don't even know what we're talking about together. So I'm just trying to develop a kind of shared story so we can actually have a serious conversation, or rather sincere. Okay, well, thank you very much.
Hello, Jason. Thank you very much for your presentation.
Sure.
I actually have two questions.
Yeah.
The first one thing I noticed was that you're primarily talking about visual attention, or that's the way I would describe it. And have you ever considered also thinking about other sensory perceptions?
Okay, so I don't primarily talk about visual. A lot of my examples may have been based on that by accident. But by attention, I understand a certain way in which phenomena are prominent, and those phenomena could be anything. They don't have to be visual. They can be visual, auditory, conceptual, so on, tactile, whatever. But I conceive of that there are no separate realms or spheres of experience. You don't have vision, you don't have imagination, you don't have memory. I think they are just different phenomena, which we describe in terms of that's a memory phenomena, that's a visual phenomena, and these are all part of the same structure of experience. And you can say I was immersed in a daydream, you can say I was focused on a chair, you can say I was focused on the itch of my leg, or I was distracted by suddenly intense self-awareness. It applies to everything. It's a very general theory of attention. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, for sure.
Cool.
Thank you.
Sure.
Because also I was wondering how specifically in the first two things that you, like the merging and I forgot what the first one was.
The categories, expansion, contraction, merging.
Because I feel like those were very much, at least the examples that you showed were very much also intertwined with the sense of I, like me merging with something else. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if you make a distinction there between perceptions that, or I guess that would be more of like an interpretation of me being there or me just observing something else that is changing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so this is a very good question. What I wanted to also point out in the plasticization part is it's not simply the case that I would say the self is a phenomena in experience just like anything else is, like a chair, an itch in your leg. I try to say subjectivity is different from the self, where subjectivity refers to the particular way in which your experience is changing, the style you have. That's just to say you are your experience. The self is a phenomenon that appears in experience. It's something that can be the theme in the context or in the margin. And sometimes the self as a phenomenon can retain its structure. Quite generally, you have your usual sense of self, and a bunch of other stuff is going all gloopy or changing and merging into one another. But sometimes the self phenomenon can merge with other phenomena, or the whole field can be this merged one thing, and then people say, it wasn't that they weren't separate things anymore, including myself. There was one thing, and it had different aspects. Yeah, so it could be either of those two cases. Does that answer?
Thank you, yeah.
Okay, sure.
Hi, thank you very much for that wonderful presentation. I had to laugh here and there quite a bit. So, given the case that you kind of work with these phenomenological reports, I mean, there always is this issue of reporter bias, right? Like, nobody really talks about if it was an okay experience. Like, it's only the very good or the very bad. Is there, like, that's why I was also so intrigued by your anarchic methods of selecting basically just whatever comes your way. Like, do you think that method somehow addresses this reporter issue?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the reporter issue is just inherent to how you can't study anything but by people's reports or doing it yourself. And then you also can gain understanding by reporting. Like, so there's always going to be some kind of reporter bias, but it depends what you mean by reporter bias. A bias could be a certain way in which someone's interpreting it. If you're going to say it's just a certain, like a very subjective view, well, that's just what experience is, right? And so the method is by gaining a large spectrum and looking for the very common features, you sort of balance that out, right? Because the most common things is a way of counterbalancing biases of specific interpretations. So that's how I approach that issue.
Yeah, plus it also kind of makes sense to get like the endpoints of the spectrum and say everything else falls somewhere between the unsense and becoming one with a chair, you know?
Yeah, so what I really want to stress when I talk about structural changes is that things don't just happen in psychedelic experiences. They happen there's a whole process of movement that happens, and that can be to greater or lesser degrees and in certain ways. So yeah, there's a whole spectrum of experiences that happen, yeah.
Thank you very much.
In between those points, yeah, sure.
Hey Jason, thank you for the talk. I really like that there's some philosophical things to say about this also, because I think that's really important, what you do. And I was wondering, the unsensing, would you see it adjacent to the ineffability that kind of the mystical experience questionnaire has in there, or would you say that's something completely different?
It's part of it, I would say. So, but I think this is another thing that comes out when you study a lot of, this is going to sound paradoxical, but the many different ways in which people say something was ineffable, right? That's a lot of but sometimes people say it was ineffable because it was changing so much. I'm like about to describe it, now it's not that anymore. Or people can say it's ineffable because it's so abstract, I have no words for it. So I think there's a whole spectrum of ineffability, spectrum of ineffability. Things can be more or less describable, and for different reasons. Too fast, too bizarre, can't remember, And again, so it's very much linked to unsense. But for instance, in the first category of mush, it's ineffable because everything's happening too quick and everything's like everything else. But in the second category, it's ineffable because it's too abstract. There's no words for it, even though it's more stable. And these are like differentiations that are not present, for instance, in that part of the mystical experience questionnaire. There's just ineffability. Ironically, no one knows what anyone means by ineffability. What it means to say that you couldn't say anything? But I think there are different reasons for which people can't say things about it, yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah,
okay.
Thank you.
We'll take one last question.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I think pulling through so many reports isn't that easy, and finding a language important. As a medical doctor, I'm trying I'm planning to treat patients with psychedelic substances, and my question is, when characterizing those experiences to patients, it's about having the right language, right? So I was wondering if you were looking also at the meta level of attention, because it's about how people focus their attention, how they're open to the experience, how they are able to do all those things that you are categorizing in a way that is therapeutic. And can you extract aspects of how people are dealing with their attention from the data you looked at?
How they're dealing with their attention?
Or how they describe the way they perceive attention, how they are employing it, how their sense of self essentially is intertwined with attention. Yeah.
Okay, that's a very interesting question. It's very important to the general philosophical debate about attention. It's like, well, is there such a thing as being active when you attend and being passive when you attend? Those senses of being active or passive, like I choose to concentrate on that or I don't choose to concentrate to a loud bang, I'm passive there, that's something that people describe as becoming quite strange or confusing during psychedelic experiences often. Sometimes they might say, and this can often be more common to lower doses, that they feel like they're more active, like they can attend to more. They have a greater capacity there, but then sometimes people say, well, anything that happened during my time, I have no sense of free will anymore. Or sometimes it can be the case that the very distinction becomes completely confused. So people do describe it often in that ways in terms of what they are doing when they're attending. But this points to my earlier point. I don't think there is any such thing as to attend as an action. And I say that because I think it's very common when people have like strong psychedelic experiences for that kind of idea to come up, that things are just happening, and you're not doing anything, you're not active or passive, there's a happening, and that includes how your experience is structured and described in terms of attention. Is that to your question? You can...
It would be interesting to see how many of your reports describe it as an active process and how many describe it like happening passively, like you described.
Okay, so to that point, there's often this flip that happens where, for instance, someone can feel like they're very actively concentrating on a specific thing, and then the more deeply concentrated they get into it, the sense of activity turns into passivity, and then you are just lost. You have no sense of self. Now you feel as you're completely passive, or the divide has gone away. So sometimes what is felt to be active becomes deep passivity, or the distinction appears. People, when it comes to contraction and merging, describe that quite a lot. But in expansion, they can say, I have more of a capacity of attention. There's so much more that I can choose to attend to. So yeah, that's a good point, and some of the categories are described differently in those terms. Yeah.
All right.
Cool. Oh, thank you.
Thank you very much, Jason, and thanks everyone for keeping the attention up towards Jason, not getting lost in the chairs and the fiber of the trousers. And I'm particularly happy that finally science is getting serious about tripping balls, what's going on, and the dimension of what the fuckness. So I'm very happy that we're getting there slowly but surely.